Every individual will have an incentive to consume a resource, but at the expense of every other individual, with no way to exclude anyone from consuming. So the solutions of tragedy of common include the imposition of private property rights, government regulation, or development of collective action. Put it differently, all consumers are rivals competing against each other because they want to take over the unit of the good. Good morning and welcome to the first session in Chapter 5, Unit 2, second semester, B.B.A, Sustainable Development, where we are going to speak about the tragedy of the commons. Now, when we talk about the environmental economics, the tragedy of commons is a very, very unique and also a most interesting economic problem that we are going to discuss about. Now, what is this tragedy of common all about? Let's just have a look into it. Now, economically, when we speak, every individual will have an incentive to consume a resource, but at the expense of every other individual, with no way to exclude anyone from consuming. Now, when we talk about the law of jungle, we always say this word, the fittest of survival. Now, like exactly when you come back to the economics problem, at the cost of one, the other person consumes. And that's where the tragedy of common error starts erupting in economics. Now, why does this error happen? Is it something that we have to always go through this error? Can't there be a solution to it? And that's what we are going to look here. Initially, it was formulated by asking what would happen if every shepherd, acting in their own self-interest, allowed their flock to graze in the common field. So what does it happen exactly? Just look into it. The tragedy of common is a problem economics that when individuals neglect the well-being of a society in pursuit of the personal gain. Now, the common factor in our universe is that I want to be good. I want to be rich. I want to be a person who has fame, who has name, who has every personal gain as far as possible. But at what cost? At the cost of others. I do not care about the society. I do not care about the environment. I do not care about the people who did not have food. I do not care about those people who do not even have the access to basic needs. I only worry about myself. I want to be rich. I want to prove in this world that I'm unique. I want my name to be around every single corner of this globe. But this does not actually fit into the society. This does not fit the bill. Why? Because this leads to the overconsumption and ultimately depletion of common resource where everybody has got a right. When one person becomes rich and richer, the other person becomes poor. The gap between the poor and rich keeps on increasing. And at one fine morning, when you start looking into this picture, you'll come back and tell me that definitely the rich have got richer and they continue to be on that track. But what about those people who are still poor, who are still not able to afford their basic needs? The reason for this is that the rich person is also consuming the food, consuming the rights of that poor person. So tragically, when we start speaking about this, you will try to understand the factor very clearly that the basis of growth is happening by sacrificing somebody else's need, and this should not happen. That's where the tragedy of commons comes into picture. So it is very, very evident in economics that one has to understand growth is an inclusive. You need to include everybody. You cannot be an exclusive growth person altogether. That personality will not be counted in the society. Now, the other thing is that, let's look into a model. Now, for example, the tragedy of commons to occur, a resource must be scarce, rivalrous in consumption, and non-excludable. Now, this word, I like it very much, non-excludable. Why? Because you cannot say that certain things are specific. You cannot say that certain things are unique. You cannot say that this only belongs to me. Now, let's not go into that picture at all. I want a system which will be able to make me rich and richer every day. I want everybody to become a part of the story. I don't want anything to be specific, unique. I want this to be for every single man in this universe, made available. So the solutions of tragedy of common include the imposition of private property rights, government regulation, or development of collective action. Certain governments are so rich that they can afford paying their citizens money even if they don't go to work. Certain governments are so rich that they can even waive off all the loans. Certain governments are so rich that they can take care of the pensions and other factors so easily. But then there are still governments in this world who cannot even afford giving a basic health care to their citizens. Why is this happening in this world? It is because of the factor that certain people are gaining at the cost of others. That should not happen. That's where the tragedy of commons comes into picture. You cannot make yourself exclusive in this world. Include yourself in each and every problem. See that every common man is able to get what he really deserves. That's where you will be able to solve the tragedy of commons. This is very, very important. Each one of us, please understand this factor very clearly. When you start accumulating property in your name, when you start accumulating wealth, you forget that that wealth can also be given to the needy and poor. Now, we all know that the war that is going on in Ukraine and Russia. But how many of us can really go ahead and help those poor and needy and innocent people who have been a part of this war? Now, we all think that at the cost of two countries fighting, the other countries will now try to gather the resources, would like to make an advantage, would like to make a gain in that situation. And that should not happen. That's where environmental economics comes back to picture and says that we cannot afford doing that. We cannot afford ignoring people. We want to include people in the growth. We want every single person on this earth to get the benefit of everything as far as possible. Now, the next thing is that the tragedy of common theory postulates says that individuals tend to exploit shared resources such as the demand greatly outweighs the supply. That's a very important factor we are going to talk about, and subsequently resource becomes unavailable for the whole. Now, we all know that certain resources are common for all. Now, let's take water. But then what do we do is that we make that water, that essential element, so precious that only few can afford. We make that water so precious that certain people are completely deprived out of it. Certain people have to starve their entire life to get a sight of this water. Why is this happening? Because we believe that that common property becomes a private property when we start getting into a collective agreement on that. That private property becomes a resource to such a great extent at one point of time that property becomes priceless. You can't add a tag to it. That's exactly where the tragedy of commons happen. 99% of the time, please think, why is that the common resources like land, water, food is becoming so very expensive in this world? What is that is happening around these factors altogether? Are we making it deliberately, or are we trying to create a situation and tell people that going forward, it's only the fittest can survive? Mother Nature gave each and everything to us so that everybody can divide and equally share. We can feel the effect of it. But unfortunately, there are certain private individuals where they create a demand more than the supply, make it even more expensive, and one fine morning, the resource completely vanishes. So that would not be accepted, that cannot be adjusted also, and that cannot be taken as a part of the system. Now, the theory accuracy is subject of common debate to the economists, and they believe that this has got a highly limited in terms of its application. Though yes, there might be situations where it becomes very difficult to prove, and sometimes it even becomes so complicated that how do I get out of this situation and find some solution to it? But then, this problem which has been faced by the economist has been going on for many years, and we are trying to find out some solution for the tragedy of commons. Now the next one, Garrett Haddon an evolutionary biologist by education, wrote a very popular scientific paper which was titled The Tragedy of Commons, which was published in the year 1968 in a peer-reviewed journal called as the Journal of Science. And the paper addressed the growing concern of overpopulation, Harden using an example of sheep grazing land, taking from the early English economist William Foster Lloyd, describing it as the adverse effects of overpopulation. Now, the word overpopulation might simply sound as just an English word, but just think about the economic effect of it. When you talk about India with about 135 crore population, overlooking quite close to that about 150 crore, and when you talk about China with 157 crore population, these numbers are really terrifying. Why? Because as the population grows in a country, we don't have resource to satisfy that growing population. Today, when you talk about land, water, or any other kind of common resources like food, we don't have it. You cannot keep on increasing the natural resource with the rate at which the population grows. During the time of independence in 1947, when we were hardly about 40 to 42 crores, we have grown almost 3.5 times today. We are talking about a population of 135 to 138 crores in India. Is it manually possible, physically possible for each one of us to go ahead and satisfy the needs of the people? And that becomes a very big question. And that's why I say overpopulation is the biggest challenge that the world is facing today. There are certain countries in the world, if I'm going to talk about Finland, Norway, or Denmark, or probably Sweden, or some other Norwegian countries, or Scandinavian countries where the population is very low, like Iceland. Now, those countries are blessed with natural resources. Why? Because the population is very less, so the amount of exhaustibility of those resources are also lesser. No doubt about it. But this is not being applicable everywhere. Whereas in other countries like UK, US, India, China, Japan, the population is pretty high. So what happens here is that the tragedy of commons tend to happen in that zones, which will further lead to the depletion of resources. So we have to be cautious, extra cautious about this word called as overpopulation. Moving further, we are also going to talk about this tragedy of commons in a very simple way. In Lloyd's example, grazing lands are held as private property. We'll see the use of limited prudence of the landholder in order to preserve the value of the land and health of the herd. Grazing lands held in common will become oversaturated with livestock because the food the animals consume is shared among all the sheep herds that's been available there. So now what happens when the land becomes a private property? Now for the shepherds or the sheep who are going to go in search of food for grazing, that becomes limited, and over a period of time what happens is that the question of survival starts coming into picture. Now that's exactly where we are heading into. So sometime down the lane, please start thinking about it. We are not blessed with abundance. We are always blessed in short. There is always a demand that is unquestioned, remain completely unsatisfied. We are not able to go ahead and satisfy the demand. The demand gap is still available and applicable at all levels. So somewhere down the lane, we have to go ahead and we have to bridge this gap so that we are able to make a better sense to ourselves. Now, in economics, the tragedy of commons may occur when an economic good is both rebellious in compensation and that of non-excludable, as we have spoken, and these goods are in the common pooled resources good as opposed to that of the private goods factors. So the more we talk about the commonality, the more we talk about sharing, that's where the tragedy of commons comes into picture. For this cow, the grass is common. But for them, when you start talking at a macro level picture, this land does not belong to them. The land is held by somebody. So what happens for them? The food becomes a shortage factor altogether. Now that's quite interesting factor to see. As you start squeezing the resources, people get completely into trouble. And that's where the alarm bell rings, and we have to start thinking about how we can make the judicious use of resources available. Now, the other thing is that a rival good means that only one person can consume, which is very important, and it cannot be shared like watching a TV or mobile kind of thing. And when someone consumes a unit of good, that unit is no longer available. Now, let's say that there is a precious or very healthy food that's available in a particular part of this universe, but that cannot be consumed by all because the price that you have to afford is quite expensive. It's quite high. So what happens is that the rich person who's able to afford that food goes ahead and consumes it for his longevity. But what happens to that poor person who cannot? Why? Because two reasons. One, he is not able to afford, and two, that food is not available anymore. Already a person has consumed it. So that's exactly this rival good factor comes into picture. One, we talk about availability, and two, we talk about affordability. If these two factors are challenging for a common man, at the end of the day, we will not be able to get the goods that we want. Now, put it differently, all consumers are rivals competing against each other because they want to take over the unit of the good. They don't want to give it to anybody else. And this order of tragedy is to occur must also be scarce. And what happens here is that because of this kind of consumption, you don't get a uniform distribution of goods available across. And sometime down the lane, you would start thinking it very, very clearly that the total stock will start subtracting and it will be held in only very few people's hands. So at the end of the day, you will start thinking that it's only those few people who turn out to become the monopolists there. So the market turns out to become complete monopoly and people feel that this is the time we are stuck. So that should not happen. We want an open and a free market where every goods are available with everyone. Now, a good that is non-excludable means that individual consumers are unable to prevent it from the others consuming the good. So this is also a very big challenging case. Why? Because you cannot stop a person from consuming because he has the affordability and availability. He has the time, money and energy to go ahead and take it away. And that's what he does. It's a combination of properties, common pool, scarce, rivalry in consumption, non-excludability, all those things sets it across by which the tragedy of commons also comes into picture. So this is very, very important for all of us to understand and take it forward. Now, in this factor, we are also going to talk about each consumer will maximize the value whatever they get by consuming the good. Yeah, they take the best time in terms of consuming the maximum value and they ensure that they consume the maximum part of that resource so that when it gets depleted, the other person will not have their share. So when it goes on like this, what happens here is that producing of the same variety of good or probably the same factor of good is not available in the market, by which what happens, it prevents others from investing, it prevents others from holding that good, and finally that good becomes completely exclusive. And that's exactly where the tragedy of commons starts erupting. Now, overcoming the tragedy of common of errors, let's start looking into it. A critical aspect to understand it is that we want to see the role of institutional and technological factors playing inside. We want it to be common. Human societies have to be evolved in such a way that not enforcing up the exclusive rights, making it very, very clear enough that this is available for all. We need to practice equality in terms of economic value rather than equality just in terms of theory factor altogether. Now, the regulatory solutions, that's also very, very important. One possible solution is the top-down government regulation or direct control on the common pool. Let the government have the control. Let the government decide whom it has to go. Let it not be under the hands of the private. At some point of time, we don't want that privatization to start coming up completely. Specifically, if you start in India, let's look at railways as an example. One side, we want railways, which is a very, very common pool, common sector, which has been shared by millions of people as a transportation usage sector altogether, as a transportation vehicle. This sector needs to be privatized. Why? Because the government feels that the revenue is falling down. It requires modernization. It requires a better support. Now, that might be the government's long-term view and plan. But on the other side, privatization is not the solution. Why? Because once it gets privatized, the jobs of hundreds and thousands of people who are working in railways might be in jeopardy. Second thing, once it gets to the hands of private, the pricing factor will play a very big role. And the third thing is that once it is privatized, the companies will try to compete against each other and try to hold back the resource. The availability for a common man would again come under question mark. So what happens here is that we are trying to make you understand about this factor very clearly, that the government has to take charge of all the common pooled resources and give access to the public. Then the governance comes into picture and we will be able to run the scenario even better. Now, assigning the private property rights over resources to individual, another possible solution. Yeah, we can give it to the others, effectively converting that common pool resource into a private good. Institutionally, that depends on developing some mechanism to define and enforce certain private property rights which might occur as an outgrowth of existing institutions. So yes, we can give this right factor to certain individuals who are ready to take up the responsibility and make sure that the resource is available at the right time, at the right place for the commoners. And it's a collective solution. So this brings in the factor that, overcoming the tragedy is by through a cooperative collection solution method, where we will be able to bring back those factors, where we will be able to bring those common pooled resources together so that every commoner is being able to make the best use of the resource that is given. Now, the other factor that we have been talking about in the collective is that by limiting the use to local farmers and herders, managing using of the practices such as crop rotation, seasonal grazing, providing of enforceable sanctions against overuse, these collective arrangements can be bottom solution in order to prevent this tragedy of commons. But those are some things which have to be practiced religiously, and we need to bring in a long set of rules and regulations into these factors. With this, I come to the end of this session. I hope and believe that all the resources presented through this presentation would be of a great value to you, both in terms of theory as well as in the practical walk of life. In the upcoming sessions, we will be looking into some of the important concepts in environmental economics. But until then, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session.